Okay, just one moment. Let me set it up. Can everyone see my screen? Okay, perfect. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Eric, for the introduction, and thank you, Jennifer, for the information. We are alive. So thank you for joining us today. This is the user testing method feasibility workshop for beginners. My name is Estela. I am a UX designer at SAP working on the Commerce Cloud. I have about 2 years of professional working experience in the field. My specialty includes user testing, product strategy, and design system. And here I have Kenneth with us today to run this workshop together. Many of you may know him from the design thinking workshop. Kenneth, would you like to say something?
Yeah, so I'm a UX researcher at Change Healthcare. So I work with, I specialize in doing research and doing user testing, as well as working with content and copywriting. Yeah, excited to be here for the workshops.
Perfect. Thank you, Kenneth. So here is an overview of this workshop. I will begin with the introduction to user testing by going over what it is, why is it important, and how do you actually run it. And we will take a look at different types of user testing, and user testing methods and the data collection. We will also talk about what heuristic evaluation is and how to run it. We will discuss how to write a user testing plan at the end. And me and Kenneth will share with you how do we actually do user testing at our workplace. Just a quick disclaimer, this is a workshop for beginners, so we will get into the nitty-gritty of the user testing. So what we're looking at today is going to be really a user testing 101. For those who have a lot of experience in user testing, please bear with us today, and hopefully you will leave with something new. We have a lot to go through, so we will have to leave the Q&A session at the end. But of course, our hosts will try to answer as much questions as possible in the chat. And then just so you know that the session can get a little bit content heavy. And for those who are based in Pacific time zone, I know it's the afternoon, and you've had a long day prior to this session. But user testing is a science, so we will have to get very technical. But it is an incredibly important skill to master for UX designers. So let's get started. First and foremost, one of the competition judging criteria for the protothon is to create a user testing plan for your design. You don't have to actually run it in 24 hours, but we will be asking you to come up with a practical plan. So I hope this workshop is going to be useful for you. So what is user testing? It is a method of testing the usability of the website, app, or other digital product by observing the real users as they try to complete the realistic task on it. During this testing session, a researcher or a facilitator would observe the participants' behavior and document the feedback. Now, there are a lot of ways to think about usability, but there's a known definition by Jakob Nielsen, who is one of the pioneers of usability studies and evaluation of design. He has come up with it's generally acceptable within the realm of international standard and also human-centered interaction, HCI experts. And here's how we break it down into 5 constructs. First is learnability. Is it easy to learn the user interface? Can user get on board quickly? And then the second one is efficiency. Once the user has learned the product, are they able to complete their task efficiently? Third is memorability. The user should be able to return to the product and not have to relearn it again. And if you're going to take some time away from the design to come back to it, do you still remember how to use it? Fourth is errors. Users should make few errors and recover easily. Can they revert back to the previous state if they make a mistake? And lastly, we have satisfaction. The product should be pleasant to use. Is there a lot of frustration when users interact with your product? How often have you seen people get frustrated with a particular technology? So that's why user testing is extremely important, because it helps designers to identify problems and it uncover design opportunities for improvements, and to really learn about how target user interact with your design. And that the product is not going to be used in isolation, in a vacuum. So design is very contextual and it varies in different scenarios. You can't really control how user actually interact with your technology. So the goal of user testing is for us to validate our assumptions and hypotheses along the way. So how do you run user testing and what do you need? What happens during the user testing session is that you will have a facilitator who will assign a task to the participants. They'll typically read the disclaimers and informing about participants what the test is going to be. And as the participants performs these tasks, there will be a note taker, and then as well as a facilitator will observe the participants' behavior, and they will note down the feedback from their behaviors or answers to the questions. And there may be pre-test and post-test questions to further understand participants' experience with the product. And lastly, you will need setting up the task. We should always reuse the real task with real users and have them complete the testing in a real or at least similar environment. This is critical because we want to imitate or at least recreate the realistic user scenarios so that we can find out how exactly the product is perceived by your user. So during the testing session, you will collect either qualitative or quantitative data, or perhaps both. The qualitative data comes from your descriptive notes, questions or observations, such as how the user explains the interface or their opinions on the interaction. And you can look at their faces when they're using your product. Are there frustrations? And it also includes any anecdotes or transcripts or descriptions of the problem that user might run into or any critical incidents. So what we're really looking at is a descriptive description, whereas the quantitative data is something that you can measure through numbers. So such as on a scale of 1 to 5, how easily to learn a product, or on a scale of 1 to 5, how satisfied is the user with the product. So same with efficiency, errors, things like that. So for example, how many errors occurred when a user complete a task. And you can time how long does it take for someone to do a certain things with the product as well. So they're all things that you can measure quantitatively through numbers. So there are 3 main types of usability testing. Which specific type works for you really depends on a few things. Is there enough resource? Who is your target audience? What are you trying to look for through user testing? And what is your goal for conducting this user testing? Are you looking for areas of improvements? Are you trying to validate your assumptions? So these are some factors that you would have to take into consider which type of user testing that you're going to choose. So let's look at them one by one in a little bit detail. First, we have moderated and unmoderated testing. So a moderated test, as the name suggested, it's monitored and guided in person or remotely by a facilitator. And an unmoderated testing session is done without direct supervision. Participants might be in a lab or at home and using their own device to complete the task. So the main difference is that the moderated testing usually produces in-depth results thanks to the direct interaction between the researchers and the test participants. but it can get really expensive to organize and run because you might need to borrow a lab and you might need to hire a trained facilitator and even provide compensation for the participants. So the cost can get really high with the moderated testing. On the other hand, the cost of unmoderated testing is lower because there's a lot more freedom in terms of how you run it. And you don't have to run a lab. Users are doing that in their own home. But however, the results can be superficial because you can't have this direct interaction with the participants, and it will be difficult to follow up post-test as well. And then we have in-person versus remote testing. So the in-person testing requires the test to be completed in the physical presence of a facilitator or a researcher. And the remote testing can be done over the internet or by phone. So compared to the remote testing, in-person tests provides extra qualitative data, like we mentioned before, because you can observe and analyze participants' body language and their facial expressions, or document any incidents like we mentioned previously. And of course, in-person testing can be more expensive and time-consuming since you have to find a suitable place, block out a specific date, and possibly compensate the participants. And lastly, we have explorative versus assessment versus comparative testing. The main difference for these three is that they generate different types of information for you as a designer. First of all, the explorative test is more open-ended. You typically invite participants to join a design workshop to brainstorm, such as participatory workshop or design thinking workshop, and you share opinions about concepts and ideas. It's usually done in an early stage of design to help you understand users from a more intimate perspective. Second of all, you have assessment, which is used to test users' satisfaction with the product. So this one is very specific. It gives you the information about whether user is satisfied with the design and how satisfied they are with the design. And then lastly, we have comparative research. It is to ask user which of two solutions they prefer. And usually you would present the two competitors' product and ask for feedback. So it really depends on your team's specific needs and the resource to decide which of these workshop the testing works better. So one of the most important things when it comes to planning the user testing is the feasibility. You need to think about the trade-off. So it can be beneficial to rent a lab or a meeting room to run a study, but is it worth the cost? On the other hand, you can't just skip user testing because the setup is too complicated. So maybe we can look at other choices that supports our situation. So what are some common user testing methods that we can use for our design? So there are 7 top or say most popular user testing methods. But today we're just gonna look at the first 2 from a feasibility perspective. And of course, you are more than welcome to look up the rest of them. So for example, guerrilla testing is when you walk on the street and then ask for random people to stop and then take a look at your user interface and maybe complete 1 or 2 tasks on the spot. Guerrilla testing is usually very easy to get a lot of feedback and a lot of data, but because of COVID and then because there's only 24 hours for protothon, it's obviously not feasible at the moment. So what we're going to look at today is first two, contextual inquiry and card sorting, where you can do it at any setting. It can be remote, it can be in person, and it helps to gather a quite amount of information. So contextual inquiry It is a UX research technique that helps a product team to obtain information about user experience from a real user. It begins with asking participants a set of questions about their experience with the product and observing while they work in their own environment. This technique is useful for getting this rich information about users, including their workspace, like what is their personal preference and what are their habits or routines during the day. Try to get this information at the beginning of design collaboration process because it will help you to design a well-tailored experience. And how do you actually conduct a contextual inquiry? So it began with the participants to establish the trust and communication with each other. During the introduction, you will introduce yourself and let the participants know that the reason behind your inquiry. You will typically ask permission to record the whole experience. Let them know that when the recording has started or stopped. And the most important part is that you will have to let participants know that there's no right or wrong answers. You're testing the product, not people. And during the actual testing process, participants will interact with the product while you observe the interaction. Make notes of their pain points as well as things that went well. All these pros and cons will come to help you to find areas of improvement later on. And after the test is finished, you will summarize the results of the session to the participants and see if they want to verify certain behaviors or clear up any questions. So this empowers the participant to correct the researchers and give them an opportunity to provide additional points that they think they are important. And here we have another user testing method. It's called card sorting. It is used to discover how people understand and categorize information. It's a great method for prioritizing content and feature in the user interface. So usually it's done prior building a low fidelity mockup where you want to discover how people understand things and group different keywords together. It is a great way to validate your assumptions and hypotheses on how you organize your content and build your information architecture. How is it done is to have a facilitator place the concept on the card and allow participants to sort the cards. And typically the facilitator would ask them to explain their logic behind how they sort the cards. There are two types of card sorting, and then they're used for different purposes. So the main difference is that in the open card sorting, which is on the left, the stack of cards are pre-filled with topics and the participants needs to create labels for the groups that they choose. Whereas in the closed card sorting on the right, the researchers create the labels for the categories and ask participants to sort the cards into predefined categories. So the open card sorting is great when you wanted to design a new website or if you want to improve the existing one, because analyzing the card sorting, the card sorting results, it's easy to see whether the website is structured that way user understand, and it will match us up how people actually organize the information. Whereas the closed card sorting works the best for prioritizing or ranking features. So for example, you can apply it for the search filters in an e-commerce app. A user described all the search filters and you'll have to group them into mandatory, optional, or frequently used to maybe I never use it. So it really depends on what your purpose is when it comes to choosing which user testing method works the best. And it really depends on the limitations that you might have to work around. So before choosing the user testing methods, it's really important to have a common understanding in your team that what are you looking for today? What is your goal? And what do you wish to get out of from the user testing? So one of the technique that is often being used in any of these user testing methods is called think-aloud. And quote unquote, what is think-aloud is that it's that you ask test participants to use the system while continuously think out loud. And that is simply verbalizing their thoughts as they move through the user interface. So the benefit of doing think aloud is that, like I mentioned, you can add it to any of user testing methods that we just mentioned, or even the ones that we didn't mention. You don't need a lot of experience to facilitate. And you can use this method at any stage of in the product development cycle, because what you're trying to get out of from is how users think and behave, and the reason behind their behavior when they interact with your product. And you get very direct and straightforward exposure on how your users think about your work. However, the downside of it is that it can be an unnatural situation because you kind of require the user to keep on going with the monologue. So it's important for this facilitator to ask guided and unbiased questions throughout the process. And because what you're trying to get is this biased user behavior. So they're supposed to make unedited comments and as they interact with the product. So there is a risk that they don't speak what is on their mind. So it is important to look out for that and make sure that you can identify when is user feeling uncomfortable and then they started to edit their thoughts, and you would have to ask a series of guiding questions and make sure that they are feeling comfortable again to get the most realistic and true information from them. And of course, writing a script to think aloud for this technique is the most critical part of the presentation. I mean, the preparation, sorry. So preparing the script, write a list of questions that you might run into or you want to ask the participants is really important so that you can follow it step by step. And also having a script, the benefit is that anyone on the team can help conduct the think aloud. So you will have a formal template shared among the team, and everyone can ask the same questions to achieve the same goals. So it's really important during the preparation stage that you write out the plan and the script. And here we have heuristic evaluation. So please note that heuristic evaluation is not a usability testing method, but it is a different technique to find design problems. It follows a set of design principles. It's used to inspect interface for common errors. And these design principles are a broad set of usability statements that guide designers. They're derived from common design problems across different systems. And it's being widely accepted by designers and researchers in HCI and, of course, the international standard. And heuristic evaluation is created and designed by Jakob Nielsen. With this method, Nielsen encouraged people to do it in a specific way, but of course, there are a lot of various ways to conduct it. When it comes to heuristic evaluation, there is more freedom to who can perform it. Anyone on the team can actually do it. You don't have to find a particular user for this because all the designers or developers or even product managers can look at the design principles and evaluate the interface. And typically it involves 3 to 5 inspectors, and having each individual inspectors to evaluate the interface alone, following the design principle. And this procedure is important in order to ensure the independent and unbiased evaluations from each evaluator. And you can do the heuristic evaluation really early during the design stage, or actually any design stage, because you can work with paper A medium fidelity prototype will do fine, and a working system to understand how user interact with your design. But the benefit of including it in your early design cycle, it will be easier for you to make changes on the interface later on in the future. So there are, these are the design principles that are broad usability test statements that guide design efforts, and designers should follow when creating interface design. They're very easy to remember and really easy to apply. So let's look at them one by one. First of all, simple and natural dialogue. So if we look at this image on the right, why is there two different edit modes? What does edit mean? What happens when I just started typing the name and phone number? So does it use user's conceptual model to match the task? Does it present information exactly what user needs? Is it confusing? Is the information grouped properly? So these are things to look for when it comes to simple and natural dialogue. And the second one is speak user's language. So what type of terminology are you using on the interface? Are they easy to learn? Are these icons on Photoshop meaningful? Are they universal standard? Why are there certain standards to these icons? Which of these Windows network settings makes more sense to you on the right? So why are they using icons here on the right screen? How is icon useful in this specific case? And we have minimized users' memory load. So we are not good at remembering complicated information, and people rely on recognition instead of remember. So can your interface minimize users' memory load? So this screenshot is, I'm sure everyone has seen this and had this freaking out moment where you have no idea which option to choose. So this is when you overload users' memory at the moment. So what can you do to improve this? And what would happen if you keep overloading their memory on all the stages of user interaction? Will they be satisfied? And will they be able to complete the task efficiently? So those are really the key element that comes in for user experience. And be consistent. Is the interface consistent across all sites? Why is this OK button jumping between left and right, moving on to different dialogues? When there is a lack of consistency on the interface, user would have to relearn it every time when they encounter the new pattern. So there's going to be a lot of problems with the learnability and the memorability of the UI. So make sure that your interface is consistent in terms of the design. When you're using a certain color on the buttons, make sure that you apply it across the way. And colors, font, they're all like this little cute visual cues that you can help either improve users' efficiency or you can really make them frustrated with your product. And provide feedback. Does your UI continuously inform user about what the system is doing? How long is the response time? So when you hover over the Photoshop on the icons, there's a preview of what this tool is coming up right away. So what happens if it doesn't come out? Because like as we know, Adobe applications such as Photoshop, Premiere Pro, they can be really hard to learn. And there are a lot of icons that they use across the user interface. So if they don't provide enough feedback right on time, it will cause a lot of problems for users to learn about the product. So it will dramatically change their learnability of the interface. And do you have a clear marked exit? Make sure you offer an easy way to get out of the situation. So as you probably heard of that, Amazon was notorious for being extremely challenging to cancel its subscription. There are tons of articles about its dark pattern. And whenever people talking about dark patterns, that's Amazon is always their go-to example. So how do you assist user to leave the service or leave the product? How do you even close it? When you, like for example, on a specific Windows example, it says, do you want to restart? Yes, no, and cancel. So with the little description or explanation to tell user what does these options represent, what kind of consequence that you get, it will help them to ease their decision making and or anxiety when it comes to decision making. And then we have, does your application provide enough shortcuts? So can we let experienced user perform tasks quickly? Do you have a set of shortcuts that user can pick up quickly? So how do you show them? How do you inform users that they can use certain shortcuts to get to that option? And those are very key to look out, especially when you're designing something that is more complicated and practical. Does your interface deal with errors in a positive manner? People make mistakes all the time. How do you help them recover from these mistakes? A rule of thumb is never to shame your users. And then when it comes to telling them there's an error, you always have to come with an explanation of what specific error that they're looking at. And does your application or product provide help? When user needs to find certain things, how long does it take for them to discover help? So when you're shopping on Apple and you run into a problem with your product, you have to go through a couple stages in order to either get connected to the customer service, or you might be able to find answers to one of your questions by using one of these choices. But does it really help with and then put users into ease mind? Well, it really depends, and it depends on how complicated your application is. It depends on how specific the questions can get. So these are some design principles that you would have to take into account and think clearly for those decisions. So that's it. That's 9 simple principles of design, but they are just very high level principles, and it's definitely not a checklist for a perfect design. You would have to run an actual user testing to validate whether your design works, but heuristic evaluation is generally a very good start for you to kind of use it as a guideline when it comes to making design decisions. So let's talk about user testing ethics. Well, testing can be stressful because it is a test and you're kind of putting most of the time, it's a few facilitator or note taker versus one participant. So it can be extremely uncomfortable for certain people. And oftentimes participants felt the pressure to perform, and when they make errors, they get a little bit anxious. And oftentimes when we use the technology, and when we run into an errors, we always would either blame ourselves or get really frustrated with the situation. So errors is definitely inevitable. And sometimes participants might felt a little bit inadequate because they can't figure out how to perform certain tasks. So it's extremely important that you let your user know ahead of time and even throughout the entire testing session that you're testing the product, not the people. So if they can't figure out how exactly to perform certain task, there is something wrong with the design. So make sure that they know that and ask for their consent when it comes to recording. And a rule of thumb, participants should always be treated with respect. So that was a lot and that we just went through. And the most important thing, well, actually one of the most important thing about this competition is to come up with a user testing plan. And to plan a user testing, typically you need an evaluation goal, which clearly specify what is it about the experience or the UI that you're testing. Are you looking for areas of improvement? Like I mentioned, are you trying to just simply validate your assumptions? And what is your assumptions? So make sure that you have a very clear goal of what you want to get out of the testing. So like, sorry, there's no more slide. Okay. So right, like I mentioned, do you want to make improvements, address the pain points? And then also the goal of any usability test is to evaluate the system using the real task and the real users. So you would have to make sure that the people that you're recruiting are the realistic users of your, or the target user at least of your product. And the construct. If you're choosing the usability testing, make sure you list out your construct. So remember what we said at the beginning about usability, what is usability? So there's learnability, efficiency, memorability, errors, and satisfaction. So which of these are you looking for to test? Well, you don't have to do all of them at the same time, of course. Usually, or in the most case scenarios, you would test one of them in the one test, one part of the testing session. So you can have multiple, but when users are performing a certain task, it's best when you're focusing on one. So what is, maybe you're looking for learnability, then during the learnability testing session, try not to ask too much questions about or focusing too much on how many errors that they make, because it will help you as a researcher to eliminate as much distractions as possible and then get most of the feedback from the user. So which of these constructs is most important to you? So think about which one would you rather, or at this current stage of design, which one is more important for you? So for example, if you are launching or not launching, but if you have designed a onboarding experience for a product, then maybe learnability is, and then also the memorability is something that you might be looking for. And if you are testing on efficiency, then come up with a few tasks, like from, for example, draw a circle and then paint it with certain color in Photoshop, then efficiency or errors, that is something that you might be looking for. So it really depends on your goals. So go back to your goals and look at what you have come up and agreed among your team and choose the construct carefully. And also you will need to let us know what is your evaluation method that you're going to use. So what type of evaluation method are you planning on using? Is it going to be a contextual inquiry? Is it going to be a guerrilla test? Is it going to be lab usability testing? And so it really depends, like I mentioned before, on your needs and also whether it's feasible for your team. So think realistically about the specific methods that you're looking for. And we also need a little bit details on how you're going to find participants. So usually you would post a survey to ask a set of pre-test questions to recruit your potential users. They should be people who are your real end users. Like I mentioned before, you want to test it with the real user in a real situation. So you really want to find people who matches the actual system and who is supposed to be using it. And procedures. So this part is optional because it can get a little bit complicated. And we didn't really have a lot of time to go into to see exactly how you run a user testing. So this part is optional, but it is good to know that when you're running or planning a user testing, you always need to write out the entire procedure. How do you plan to run it? So will there be a pre-test questionnaire section? Are you going to asking participants to sign a consent form? And how do you plan on collecting data? What type of data are you going to collect? Are they going to be qualitative or quantitative? What will participants do when the testing starts? But like I mentioned, this is optional because you only have 24 hours to work with. But in the long run, the procedure is the most critical part of the user testing plan because it will help you to save a lot of time and prepare for any unexpected incidents. So before we move on to the next part, I'd like to share with you a user testing example. So in this example, you will see you list out, you have a list of scenarios. So you describe what type of scenarios are that the user is going to play into, and what are some tasks that they're going to complete throughout the testing. And then also, what are your questions that you might want to ask during the test session? And so for here, the process, like you will have introduction and what you do during the introduction. And you will move on to explain the purpose, establish the trust and communication between the participants. And then, of course, you will always have to explain that the participants is not being tested. The only testing thing is the prototype. So this is what a procedure would typically look like. And of course, you would have efficiency, emotional response, satisfaction. So what are you trying to look for during the user testing? So this is an example that we had for the user testing plan. But of course, you are not going to need every parts of it. This is just simply one of the examples. It could look very different, depends on the specific case. So yeah, it really depends on your plan. So that's that. Okay, moving on. So that was a lot to digest. If you're still here with us, thank you for sticking with us today. So what we just went through was mostly an introduction to user testing. I hope this could be a place for your future study on the user testing. So it is very theory-based, but now Kenneth is going to share with you his professional experience on how to run user testing at work.
Hey everyone. So like Estela said, user testing is a very straightforward thing to do. And sort of what she talked about today is very transferable and very one-to-one in terms of taking the skills that you learn and putting it to use in an industry. So different companies and different teams all use different methods, different ways of documenting or keeping records. So I can't say it's specific to all of healthcare technology, but in my team, the enterprise imaging team at Change Healthcare, we sort of use user testing in order to do something that's called risk control measures, which is typically end stage prior to release, and it is to evaluate the actions that are taken or pre-taken in this response to a potential harm. So the product that we make are medical imaging equipment or medical imaging software. So when you go for X-rays or MRIs or stuff like that, this information or this data that's collected gets sent to something that's called the PACS, which is the Picture Archiving and Communication System. And so these images are important for physicians or doctors to make diagnoses, especially about things that are inside your body. And so what we have to do, or what we're required to do, is document and submit them for FDA compliance, because they are an American-based company. And so this includes everything from making plans to making the scripts to the actual test notes, as well as the end report. So we always start off with the plan, and sort of we always include that it is a remote user testing that is moderated, just because all of our participants are scattered across North America. So we include the goal. So what is the exact risk control measure that we're evaluating? And who are our testers? So what is their medical background, and what are their expertise in? So we follow this up with a script to just document or plan out what it is that we're going to do in the step-by-step process. This is not like the exact, because people tend to get off topic, and that's where we learn the most. But essentially, it's a guideline for us to follow in order to complete the test. And so during the test, we make sure to take very detailed notes, because this is then going to be submitted, like I said. And we compare and compile everything into a report, which explains if the risk measure was passed or if it failed, and why, as well as any recommendations to the design. So what needs to be changed. And essentially, that is why we do user testing. It's because there is a patient safety risk associated with our product, no matter what. And the goal that we have to solve as the researchers are the actions that we are taking. Are they mitigating or minimizing that risk? And are physicians aware of what's happening to the system?
So thank you.
Yeah.
And it's similar. Sorry.
Yeah.
So it's similar to SAP as well, where I work, where it's essentially exactly how we would do when we run user testing. We will have a procedure. We have like all the scripts written out. If we're using Think-Aloud, we would iterate on the questions that we ask. Make sure that you ask questions that are more guiding, that is unbiased, that you don't really like kind of imply a specific answers from them. So making sure that the question is like kind of agreed and also approved by everyone on the team is really important. And then during the testing session, we would just ask user to complete a set of tasks and ask them to and either document how many errors that they make or how they think about the product, things like that. So it is exactly how we would run it, like using the contextual inquiry or card sorting. So I don't think the theory part of user testing is too different from the actual running part. So I hope this workshop is going to be useful for you. If there's any questions, we can start addressing those. And yeah, so
I
go
was
ahead.
gonna say, Looks like one question I saw is, can you share that Google Doc? I believe it was the meaningful work like example document for user tests.
Right. I will leave that question to Eric to decide because it is a document that Eric shared with me.
Yes. Yeah, I'll share that. I'll share it. I'll share it. I'll share it on the workshop, sorry, FAQs.
Just to know that it's not a template that we're asking or we're creating specifically for Polython. It is an example that Eric had. So you don't have to have everything filled out on that according to that plan. It really depends on your specific needs and what you're looking for from the user testing. And it also depends on how much time that you have left during the 24-hour Polython. So don't get into too much details on the procedures and think too much about the details, but really to think on a high level on like why you do this, what do you plan on doing this, who is your target user, how do you plan to recruit them. So like a few things that we mentioned. And the evaluation goal is really important because it tells us that, or maybe it tells your managers or whoever in a workspace that like why is it to run this. So in most of the time, especially in startups or maybe I'm making this up, but sometimes it costs a lot to run user testing. So if you have a clear goal and you know exactly what you're looking for, you have your construct ready, then it will help you to save a lot of time. And booking the participants is not always easy, and then you have to make sure the schedule works across your team. So the planning part is really important, and that's why we're looking for from this competition is that if whether you have a clear understanding of how to do this and also why exactly you're doing this. But yeah, so I guess this is it. We've come to the end of the session or the workshop. I hope this is helpful, and thank you so much for staying with us today. And I hope you have a great day or great workshop session tomorrow.